Welcome back to Talking Foreign Affairs with Adil Cader. In today's episode, we are extremely honored to be joined by the one and only Her Excellency, Mrs. Mary Robinson, former President of the Republic of Ireland. We'll be talking on climate justice, a topic very close to Mrs. Robinson. I should also note that she has recently written two excellent books on the topic, and I would highly recommend these to my viewers. Please do check out the links posted below. Mrs. Mary Robinson was the first woman elected as the President of Ireland and held the role from 1990 to 1997. She has been credited with transforming the role with the presidency of inclusiveness, equality, and peace building. Following her role as president, she served as the first ever UN High Commissioner for Human Rights from 1997 to 2003. In this role, she widened the Commission's brief to include many women's issues, such as food and water security, shelter, and healthcare. Mrs. Robinson later served as the UN Secretary General's Special Envoy in three areas, most notably in climate change. Robinson has served on numerous boards, written many books, and delivered a famous TED Talk on the topic we are talking about today. She has won numerous awards for her public service. Most prominently, in 2009, Mrs. Robinson was awarded the US Presidential Medal of Freedom by President Barack Obama, the highest civilian honor bestowed by the US. President Obama famously said that Miss Mary Robinson, quote, illuminated a better future for our world. That still holds true today, where she spends her time on the fight for climate justice through her foundation. She also does this through her role as an adjunct professor of climate justice at Trinity College in Dublin. Mrs. Robinson, thank you so much for joining us and welcome to the program.
It's a pleasure.
Mr. Robinson, to start off with, could you please briefly explain what climate justice is?
Climate justice is a people-centered approach to the impacts of climate change, and it begins with the range of injustices, if I could put it that way, and I'll just cover them briefly. First of all, climate change affects disproportionately and much earlier the poorest countries, the poorest communities, small island states, and indigenous peoples, and they're the least responsible. They also happen to be the Black and brown and indigenous peoples in our world, so it's also a racial injustice. Secondly, the gender injustice within that women have different social roles in many contexts. They don't have as much power. They don't often have access to credit. They may not even have the same rights like land rights. And yet they have to put food on the table. They have to make their communities resilient. Thirdly, the intergenerational injustice that young people, climate activists, those involved in Fridays for Future and other youth campaigns have been reminding us of, that they know they're not going to have a safe future unless we take more urgent steps. And fourthly, and it's a subtle one, the injustice of the different pathways to development. Industrialized countries like Ireland and Australia, we built our economies on fossil fuel. Now we have a responsibility to wean ourselves off as rapidly as possible, but do it with just transition for workers in coal and oil and gas, and in Ireland, peat, and their families and communities. Developing countries need to develop, so they need access to the clean energy, and they haven't had the support for investment, etc., that they would need. And the fifth injustice is, of course, the injustice to nature herself. The huge loss of biodiversity, the extinction of species that we're seeing, all the breakdown of ecosystems, which is happening at a very worrying rate. And all of those injustices are summed up in needing a climate justice, an approach that understands that the rich world that has caused so much damage must pay for much more climate adaptation and ultimately loss and damage.
You raised some good points about injustice, and I think one misconception is that people tend to think this is only something that affects developing countries, but this is something, as you've noted in your books and speeches before, there are inequalities within developed countries as well. So from your experience being the president of Ireland, could you just share some of the inequalities between those more developed parts of the countries and the more developing parts of the country, the inequalities between those two?
Well, for developing countries, this has been a lived reality for a long time now on climate. I saw it when I formed a small organization called Realizing Rights and started working in African countries after my 5 years as UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. I hadn't spoken about climate because there was another part of the UN dealing with it, but I saw the undermining of all kinds of rights to food and water, health, education, etc. And they're the 11 stories in my book on climate justice, and 9 of them involve women, but there are also 2 good men. And the stories are stories of building resilience, but I had to search more to get stories for the developed world. There are 2 stories based in the United States. One is after the Hurricane Katrina. This wonderful woman who lived in East Biloxi. So her salon and her home were wiped out. And Sharon, was African American. She said herself, she grew up on the wrong side of the tracks. And that's her story of becoming an accidental activist and fighting back and helping her community that had been devastated by the hurricane. The other one in the United States is in Alaska, and she's a scientist, Sheila Cochran, and she was watching the erosion of houses and villages with seawater rise and no money in the wealthy United States to deal with that. In Europe, I had to find a story right in the north of Sweden of the Sami people, again with a wonderful young Sami activist who was able to tell that story. Whereas now, even in the last few years, this was published in 2016. Even since then, I would have no trouble finding climate justice stories in the richer parts of the world, because it's everywhere now. Everywhere is being affected. You've seen it in Australia, including Western Australia, Perth, which I visited when I was president. I started my state visit in Perth, in fact.
You do raise how this is a very important global issue, and something I do quite find surprising is that there's so many actors in many states around the world that don't actually see it quite seriously. One of the stories I did enjoy reading when I was doing some research is how you work closely with representatives from Costa Rica and Mexico into getting language on the Paris Agreement. And it was a bit of a challenge because initially, if I'm correct, you had got, between human rights and climate change, and you had initially got some language in the operative clauses, but then that had to be moved to the preamble clause. But one would think that this is a very serious issue. Why would there be so much hesitancy for something like this to have such language in an operative clause?
Yes, you might well ask. I mean, to me, this should all be operative and urgent language in the Paris Agreement, but it was a wonderful victory to actually get it into the preamble. The Paris Agreement is unique in climate space for talking about human rights in such a broad and convincing way, including just transition. That had never been done before. And that was because of the pressure. Yes, we'd have liked to have had it in the operative language, but actually, the most important contribution that climate justice made to the Paris Agreement was the role of small island states and indigenous peoples and civil society, the marching in Paris for the mantra, if you like, 1.5 to stay alive, meaning we want the goal to include reference expressly to 1.5. And it was the Marshall Islands, Tony de Bruyn, that led that. And there was a high ambition coalition, and he led it. And the United States and the European Union joined to get the reference to 1.5 degrees. And then the Paris Agreement had to ask the scientists, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, please explain the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees. And if we need to stay at 1.5 degrees, what should we do? And that was the famous report of the IPCC in October 2018, saying there is a big difference because in that time, the coral reefs may disappear, the permafrost will melt hugely, and all kinds of things. The Arctic ice might disappear, and so we have to reduce by 45% our emissions by 2030. That's only 8 years away now, and we are still not at all on track. But the important thing was the scientists are now stating clearly where we need to be. There's a report coming out today of the IPCC on how we need to cut emissions. And I think it will help us because we're very distracted by the war in Ukraine. We're very distracted by the high cost now of food and fuel. And the world can't somehow keep its focus on the scientific existential threat that we face, which is the climate and biodiversity emergency.
And you did raise some good points in regards to how civil society did play their part. And that takes me to my next question. On your website, on the Mary for your Foundation for Climate Justice, you noted some principles of climate justice, one key one being the effective use of partnerships. This sort of ties into the role of multi-track diplomacy, that there's other ways of diplomacy as opposed to government, there's NGOs, think tank, volunteer groups. Do you think that given what we've seen with climate change, especially climate justice, that over time, the national governments have lost their monopoly on the impact of these issues, and there's more room for civil societies, NGOs, volunteer groups?
I think we've realized that we will not get there if we just leave it to governments. They need the urgent push, and that has to be the broadest possible coalition of those pushing. Um, I'm chair of the group of elders that Nelson Mandela brought together in 2007. And we work closely with a lot of partners, including young climate activists. But I also, as chair of the elders, I'm part of a B team of business leaders, because the private sector also has to be involved. Investment has to be involved. Philanthropy has to be involved. And the broad civil society, the women's leadership movement, youth leadership, the small island states continuing with their leadership because of the urgency they feel every day. And all of that has to push governments into their commitments. We've seen that over and over again. I was at COP26 in Glasgow. If it hadn't been for the marching of the civil society and the calling of urgency, we wouldn't have got even what we got in Glasgow, which is not enough to fill the gap.
We did see some of the attention we saw from the global school climate strike in 2019. There are some of those who are skeptical on the protests and their ability to bring about any practical policy change. What message would you give to young people around the world who are eager to have some sort of action, but don't think their voice might result in any practical change?
I'm very supportive of the initiatives like Fridays for Future and other youth initiatives, because they're based on the science. These are very well-read, very organized young people, and I'm very grateful to them that they are able to make the impact and bring people out into the streets in huge numbers for special marches, etc. We need all of that. I would encourage anyone listening to this podcast to, please get engaged and make it personal, and then, take your own personal steps, because that'll be good for your climate anxiety. And after that, get angry with those who aren't doing more, like governments and cities and investment, etc. And most of all, I ask young people, imagine this future that we need to be hurrying towards. We need to be there in 8 years' time in a different place with half the emissions gone. Think about it. It'll be much healthier. The cities will be greener. The countryside will be rewilded, and there'll be none of the sort of deaths and asthma, etc., caused by fossil fuel. So keep talking about looking forward to that world and what it will bring, because then we'll get more impetus.
And one of the main concerns as well in regards to the practice is that many industries that rely on fossil fuel and greenhouse gases, and in their minds, any transition is seen as a threat to their industry. How would you reach out to them in joining this fight for climate justice?
We have to put more emphasis on just transition out of the fossil fuels that are destroying our world, and just transition into clean energy. I'll give you an example. In Ireland, we had to lay off 400 workers who worked for a state board which was producing turf. And because that turf is worse than coal, actually, because it's more polluting and doesn't produce as much heat. So we did that. But the area in Ireland that most of them are involved with these workers is the Midlands. And there's now a concentration on two things: bringing clean energy sources to the Midlands and rewilding the bog area so that it becomes a carbon sink again. And this is happening very consciously, but it costs money. So, the European Union has now voted a big fund for just transition. Australia needs a very big fund to help a much more rapid transition that helps workers, and we should be grateful to them for what they've done, but they must now realize that we have to move on to clean energy, or we will have no safe world. And nobody wants that. I mean, literally, anybody who's under 70 at the moment will see a world that will be chaotic in their life. Anybody under 30 will absolutely see it for a long number of years unless we change. It's so urgent and serious. We have to have a rapid, just transition.
Was this spoken a lot in regards to justice and equality in representation at the negotiation table? One thing I really like about your speech is you talk about getting grassroots women to the table. And I know you were very successful in your negotiation of the Gender Action Plan post the Paris Agreement. However, a lot of the climate bodies at the UN are led by former career diplomats or former politicians. Do you think there should be more space for some of these grassroots women who haven't had those sort of high level roles to be in some of the leadership roles at these key UN bodies?
Yes, I've seen the difference it makes when you have what we might call frontline experts on climate, like grassroots, indigenous, or young women indeed, coming to the table and telling the direct story. Now, what happened in the past was there was very vibrant activity in the civil society space at conferences, but the delegates never went there. They never heard these stories. But with our network of women leaders on gender and climate that was formed the year after Copenhagen, which had been seen as a kind of failure. In Cancun, we put together this network, and these women leaders were head of their delegations. So we worked on the gender action plan you referred to, but we also asked these ministers for environment or ministers of energy or foreign ministers, you're head of your delegation at the next COP. Make sure it includes grassroots and indigenous and young women. And I heard those voices before and ever since COP 21 in Paris, more and more. And what happens is the delegates literally put down their pens or whatever their iPads, and they hear the personal tragic stories of how villages have been affected, how small islands are going under and people are in terror every day of the king tides and so on. And it's that reality that intrudes on their pen pushing, if I could put it that way, and fighting over every phrase, because that's they see as their job. And suddenly they hear the felt human reality of climate change, and it does make a big difference. So I'm very in favor of a more inclusive COP. We didn't get it as much in Glasgow as I would have liked, partly because of COVID, to be honest. I hope that the COP in Egypt in November in Sharm el-Sheikh will be as inclusive as possible, with as much civil society and frontline defenders as possible, so that we hear how urgent it is.
Yeah, I think those are some really good points because from what I recall as well, it's usually those speeches by people who have experienced climate change up front that tend to get more attention globally on the news, online.
Yeah.
But similarly, on that note of diversity, when we look at the UN climate bodies like IPCC, UNFCCC, or the UN Environment Program, when we look at the executive staff specifically, there's been hardly anyone from the small island states in these positions. And a lot of these countries would have leaders. I know this example you've given in some of your speeches, how the leader of Kiribati had to buy some land from Fiji. Do you think there should be more representation on these executive bodies from people from these small island states?
I do very much so, and more diversity generally, because that helps decision making for a start. We all know that now. Diversity is good for decision making, gender balance, and other balances as well. But the more we can hear the voices of those most affected now, because there's still a sense in the developed world that we have to be worried about climate, but it's a thing of the future. It's not. It's not at all. It's of now. So the more we can hear the voices that have experienced over several decades, even, and certainly over quite a number of years, the impacts of climate change, that will help us to have a real sense of how urgent it is. It just cannot be exaggerated. It is an existential threat to our future.
We're now going into the section of submitted questions from listeners. Quite appropriately, the first question is, what are your thoughts on the current United Nations framework on dealing with climate justice and what needs to be changed about it?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. It's not a very effective way of decision making that you have to get consensus among 192 countries. It takes a struggle, and usually it's a weak consensus. Now, Paris, in a way, was an exception that we got that new goal of staying well below 2 degrees and working for 1.5, and that was interpreted. And now we all align to 1.5 degrees, and that's important. But it's hard to make strong progress when you've got to bring everybody with you. But the advantage is that small countries feel included, small island states feel included, and that's important. So we sacrifice effectiveness for representation. I think there is a need for better climate governance, but it's tricky because you've got to make sure that everybody's voice is heard.
Next question we have in is, with elected leaders mostly concerned about the next election cycle, how do you convince governments from developed countries that reducing greenhouse gases are an important responsibility? Does the growth of the global school climate strikes help swing public opinion to vote in favor of such policies?
That's a great question again. And of course, the distraction now of the war in Ukraine is huge. And the rise in fuel prices has muddied the picture, and countries say, oh gosh, we need all the fossil fuel. We need to drill for oil again. We need to open up what we were about to close down, etc. No, absolutely not. What we need to do is have governments follow the science. And that's why the young leaders, the Fridays for Future and other youth leaders are so important, because they absolutely focus on the science, and so must we. And we must, I'm urging us now to spend our children's money. And what I'm saying is, it is our children's money that we would spend to move more rapidly to clean energy, to refit houses so that they're energy efficient and so on. But it means that our children will have a safe future. And actually, at that stage, energy will be free, because it'll be clean energy. So, the way of living will be freer. So spend the money now to get where we need to get to fast and urgently.
The next question we have in is, according to a World Bank report, more than 200 million people are likely to migrate over the next 3 decades because of extreme weather events. Is enough being done by the UN Global Migration Compact to plan ahead for these issues?
The answer is no, and the worry is that these are real concerns. If people are forced to leave because of conflict, and look at people, how quickly they've had to move out of Ukraine because of this terrible war, an invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and the terrible scenes that we're witnessing, and driving more than 4 million out in just over a month. Climate will also drive millions, and I think that World Bank figure is probably quite accurate. Hopefully, in Europe at least, the Ukrainian crisis has taught us that we have to welcome those who are forced to leave where they live if they can't live there, because we're human beings. We have to be human to each other, and we're more likely to be human to those who look like us. So Europe has learned a lesson. It's been much more, people have talked even about the double standards of not letting people from Africa or Asia or Syria, for example, come into Europe, and then suddenly, because they're blue-eyed and look like us, they can come in. There's a truth in that, but at least we are seeing more humanity now, and I think that will help at least. But the most important thing is we can reduce the number who potentially have to leave their homes if we reduce greenhouse gas emissions. That means getting out of fossil fuel.
The next question is, in your opinion, how has COVID impacted the fight for climate justice?
That's another very interesting question. I want to leave hope at the end, so let me be positive. COVID was terrible. It caused so many deaths, and it was so unfair because poorest countries didn't have equitable access to vaccines and so on. But there were positive things that I hope will help us in a climate justice approach to the climate crisis. First of all, we learned that human behavior can actually make a difference, collective human behavior, because that's what protected us at the beginning when we didn't have any vaccines. The idea of social distancing, washing our hands, wearing masks. None of us were doing that before. It did make a difference. In the rich world, we need to make a difference with collective decisions about more energy efficiency, about reducing consumption, about changing our diet, about changing the way we move around, etc. We can do all that, and it will help. Secondly, government matters. We saw that governments that took things seriously did much better. Thirdly, science matters. And that's probably the most important lesson. We had health experts side by side with government deciding whether our economies could open or had to close again or shut down completely, etc. And finally, compassion matters. We saw during COVID much more humanity and compassion in every country and in every area, because when people are out of their comfort zone and suffering, they're more open to the suffering of others, the more they have more empathy for the suffering of others. And so that gives me hope that we will deal with this existential, urgent crisis as human beings together collectively, bring out the best of us, not the worst of us.
And we're just approaching 30 minutes, so we'll just go in for one last question. The next question is, do you think that globalization and development reconciling is possible for the future? How do we keep this relationship moving forward?
I think we're going to see changes. We're not going to see such long supply chains, partly because they're very energy intensive. We're going to see more emphasis on countries being more food secure and more energy secure with their own clean energy. And that's one of the benefits. And I hope that this will lead to a more equal society and a fairer society. I think young people need to look forward, as I said earlier, to this future that we need to be hurrying towards, as if, like a moonshot. The way, the moonshot is the reference to when John F. Kennedy did the impossible and the United States put a man on the moon. It wasn't possible when he announced it. It happened within 8 years, as it happens. This is the 8 years we have. So let's have a moonshot mentality to get to this world that will be so much more pleasant to live in, so much healthier, so much more equal and fair, so much more human, so much more fun to live in.
Mrs. Robinson, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to join us. And I'm sure all the young leaders listening have something good to take away with them and to bring change about in this world.
Just maybe one last message to the young. It was something
Sure.
that Kofi Annan used to say all the time when we were together as elders. He was the chair of the elders before me. And he used to say, you are never too young to lead, and you are never too old to learn. So let me end with that. Thank you.